The U.S. and its NATO allies have started a series of Navy drills in the Mediterranean Sea. The 12-day Neptune strike exercises come amid fears of a conflict in Ukraine, although they haven't been directly linked to the border crisis. Meanwhile, the EU is offering Ukraine 1.2 billion euros in aid to counter this supposed threat from Russia. RT's Peter Oliver has more.
Right, we've got major military drills underway in the Mediterranean involving the US Navy, the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier involved in those. It's worth pointing out that these particular war games that are underway, they weren't listed on the official schedule of what was going to be getting underway. However, the US Navy have been very quick to point out that as far as they're concerned, this has nothing to do with the situation that's unfolding in Eastern Europe regarding Russia, Ukraine, NATO and all of the tensions underway there. What we have seen, though, on Monday is a promise to increase presence of NATO forces in the east of Europe. That's come from NATO members Denmark, the Netherlands, France and Spain as well. They've all promised either military hardware in the form of warships or aircraft or in the form of personnel moving eastwards. What we have seen, though, is a response from the Russian presidential spokesperson, particularly to the announcements of new NATO troops moving eastwards and those US Navy war games that are underway. The presidential spokesperson in Moscow saying that they're paying close attention to what's happening.
Such NATO actions and increased NATO activity near our borders cannot be ignored by our military, who are responsible for the security of our country. There is a constant process of drills, manoeuvres and military build-up, which has never stopped and will continue.
Well, this all comes as EU foreign ministers are currently meeting in Brussels. Earlier, it was understood the United States and the United Kingdom pulled their either members of their staff or the families of members of staff from their embassies in Ukraine. And we heard from the EU Chief Foreign Policy Commissioner Josep Borrell, who said that as it stood at the moment, there was no intention for EU embassies to do the same just yet.
I don't think we have to dramatize. As far as the negotiations are going on, and they are going on, I don't think that we have to let Ukraine and leave.
There are splits among NATO allies when it comes to what to do with NATO, when it comes to what to do with regards to Russia and Ukraine. We've seen a lot of pressure placed upon Germany, where the Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said that Berlin won't be sending weaponry to Ukraine. Now, neighbours such as those in the Baltic states have been saying they should be stepping up and doing a lot more. Olaf Scholz remaining firm on this one, saying there won't be offensive weaponry sent from Germany. What he has said, though, is that should there be an invasion of Ukraine, that there would be serious consequences from that. He's also said that Germany will continue to send medical aid to Ukraine. It will also continue to step up its aerial surveillance for NATO based out of bases in Romania. Meanwhile, other senior political figures in Germany have been talking about what's going on. Markus Söder, who's the leader of the state of Bavaria, said that Europe must negotiate with Russia not as an enemy.
All right, here to weigh in our panel today, New York Times bestselling author and president of the Schlafly Eagles, Ed Martin, and George Samueli. He is a writer and senior fellow at the Global Policy Institute. They're in London. So, Ed, I'll go to you first. What do you make of the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine deciding to suddenly pull its staff and their families from the region? I mean, the State Department also issued a red alert travel advisory telling Americans not to travel to Ukraine or that region. What do you make of all of that?
Well, you know, I wish I wasn't so cynical, but right now I'm pretty cynical about it. I think it feels like on a Monday morning, the Biden administration is trying to move the conversation towards the drums of war. You know, a lot of the media is here talking about Wag the dog, you know, the famous movie. I don't know what to make of it, except that Joe Biden has, if he ever had control, he's lost control between last week's press conference where he said, well, we won't mind an incursion, but an invasion might make us nervous, to this ongoing, you know, the Germans won't take his phone call. I mean, America right now is without a strong leader. That's what's true. And we have a very tenuous situation. So I worry that in the path of the kinds of of actions, the direction we're going, and the Biden White House seems to like, it's towards more conflict. And that's a disaster for the American people and for others in the world. So it's very worrying and unclear at this point, as I think most of the world is pretty unclear what Joe Biden is up to, what his vision is, and certainly what his capabilities are.
Yeah, worrisome is to say the least. George, the French are doing the same thing with their civilian staff and families. Are these civilian withdrawals then a prelude to potential kinetic action at the Russia-Ukraine border? And what of these talks of the so-called false flag attacks by mercenaries to kind of goad the Russians into action?
Well, to answer your second question first, I think that's the real danger where we are right now, because Russia has said that there are only two conditions under which they might use force. One, if there is an attempt by the Kiev authorities to resolve the crisis in the Donbass by the use of force, Russia would step in to protect its nationals. And the other situation is if Ukraine, but obviously with the assistance of NATO, starts building very heavy military infrastructure on Russia's eastern border. I mean, Russia's western border, Ukraine's eastern border. And there would be a serious threat to Russian security. In those circumstances, Russia would step in and use force to remove any threatening military infrastructure. The point about the mercenaries is that that could well be a triggering point by, they mount an offensive against the Donbass, and then the Russians would step in. And there are obviously people within the United States and within NATO who would be very happy to see such a situation, because they really don't give a damn about Ukraine. Their only use for Ukraine is as a battering ram against Russia. And if they can get the Russians to intervene, then they can mobilize NATO, they can mobilize Europe into an anti-Russian stance. NATO gets a new shot of life, and Russia is excluded from Europe for a generation, maybe even 2 generations. So there is a danger that there are people within the United States, like the Victoria Nuland types, who would love to provoke Russia into some kind of an intervention.
Now, gentlemen, NATO has already begun sending ships and other weaponry to the region. Denmark is already deploying F-16 jets to Lithuania. Spain is sending ships and potentially jets to Bulgaria. France is weighing actually sending troops to Romania. I mean, how do you square all of this, given that Article 5 is not applicable here since Ukraine is not a member state? George, I'll let you take the first crack at this one.
Well, of course, what NATO is doing here is trying to generate conflict. And you're absolutely right. Ukraine is not a member state of NATO. Article 5 doesn't apply. There's no prospect in the near future of Ukraine coming into NATO. What NATO and the United States in particular, because the United States and the United Kingdom are driving all of this, no one else in NATO. So US and the UK, what they're really doing is trying to aggravate and provoke a conflict, so that if there is a conflict, they can then say, well, now, our national security is at stake, and then they present their publics with a fait accompli, because there is no way that they can justify to their respective peoples a war with Russia over what? Over Ukraine? Nobody in the UK, nobody in the United States could even identify Ukraine on the map. So they have to come up with something to show that Russia is the aggressor, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to provoke, aggravate the situation so that they can present Russia as an aggressor.
Now, Ed, how is the U.S. going to square this kind of action and leading the NATO allies to this kind of troop movement?
Well, I don't think they're going to. I mean, look, we should be very clear about this. I mean, and I'm sorry to do it, because I'm an American and I love my nation and I support my president. But this president and this White House is so not only clueless, but so obviously pushing towards an agenda that includes a conflict with Russia. It's insanity. You know, these are two nuclear powers that should be allies against some of the real bad guys in the world, in my opinion, the communist Chinese. But, you know, one thing to note is when you're in such a bad shape politically as Biden is, you're trying to change the subject, and you don't want to talk about inflation and illegal immigration. And so, but we're playing with fire, big fire here. And I think the American people see through it. I think they're fed up, and I don't think it's going to go very far. But you know what? Right now, if I'm in Europe and I'm in the Ukraine, I'm wondering who's in charge in the White House and what it's going to be. And it's pretty scary. And as you say, moving troops and allowing troops and planes, you're just goading people into a problem. And whether it's a false flag or a real flag, it's still a war, it's still violence, it's still bad.
Ed, real quick, final thoughts here. Were Sergei Lavrov and Antony Blinken lying, last week rather, when they both claimed that these talks were productive? Because this looks more like action than more dialogue.
I don't know if they were lying. I think they were spinning, and you could tell Blinken was clueless and Lavrov was the dominant figure. I think they were spinning. I don't look. It's clear what Russia wants, what they need, and it's clear that the rest of the world can't respond, and they're not responding, and so here we are.
George, quickly, final thoughts.
I think they were lying. I think when Blinken said that we are going to provide Russia with a written response to the two documents that they presented in December, I think Blinken was lying. They are not going to provide any kind of written response. I think that they're going to come up with a familiar litany of complaints about Russia, you know, the whole thing, Navalny, Skripals, Crimea. They're not going to address Russia's very serious security concerns. And so I think Blinken was lying. And of course, it just doesn't move the ball forward. We're still heading towards a serious confrontation.
This does not bode well for the rest of the world, I think. We have to leave that right